Greetings dear friends, this is your personal English coach Professor DC, and in this video we will be understanding a very interesting story. This is called The Sound Machine. This was written by Roald Dahl in 1949. दोस्तों इस स्टोरी को मैं हिंदी में समझा चुका हूँ और इसका वीडियो ऑलरेडी यूट्यूब पर अपलोडेड है, तो जिन लोगों को हिंदी में समझना है वो यूट्यूब के सर्च बार में जाएं और लिखें द साउंड मशीन, स्पेस देके लिखें मेरी चैनल का नाम यानी कि प्रोफेसर डीसी और आपको हिंदी में in depth explanation मिल जाएगा. For those of you who want to understand this story in English, stay right here with me. Without wasting any time, let's get started. It was a warm summer evening and Klosner walked quickly through the front gate and around the side of the house and into the garden at the back. He went on down the garden until he came to a wooden shed, and he unlocked the door, went inside and closed the door behind him. First and foremost, we get to know the weather of the place where all the events or incidents will be unfolding. Which season is it? It is warm summer. And what phase of the day it is? It is evening. It is a little bit hot outside. Then we are introduced to the main character of the story. His name is Klosner. Now this character called Klosner is getting inside his house, and here we are also getting to know the architecture of Klosner's house. There is this front gate, then you have a house, and behind the house there is a garden, and Klosner does not admit himself into the house. He rather takes the bypass route which takes him right to the garden. There is a path or way which is adjacent to the house, and from where you can directly reach the garden without getting into the house itself. Now here we do not know where Klosner had been, whether he went out to buy something, whether he is coming back from work. That is not mentioned here, but all we know is he is entering his house and he admits himself directly into the garden, and he's walking quickly. Looks like there is something to which he has to pay attention to. The interior of the shed was an unpainted room. Against one wall on the left there was a long wooden workbench, and on it, among a littering of wires and batteries, small sharp tools, there stood a black box about 3 feet long, the shape of a child's coffin. Here we are getting to know the details of what was inside that little wooden shed. You might be wondering, what is a shed? Shed is a place used to keep animals or things. And from these sentences, we know that the interior, the inside of that particular small wooden room was not painted, it was raw. And as soon as one entered, on the left side of that room, there was a bench-like structure erected, which was a workbench, meaning a person could work on it. It was long and wooden, and on it there were a lot of things. There were wires and batteries and small sharp tools, but most importantly, there was this black box which was about 3 feet long. It looked as if it was a child's coffin. What is a coffin? A coffin is a box used to bury the dead. Because it was small, the author has mentioned child's coffin. Now this is just a metaphor. You don't need to get bothered with the usage of these words, child's coffin. Klosner moved across the room to the box. The top of the box was open, and he bent down and began to poke and peer inside it among a mass of different colored wires and silver tubes. Klosner moved across the room to the box. The top of the box was open, and he bent down and began to poke and peer inside it among a mass of different colored wires and silver tubes. So what was the most important thing for Klosner at the moment? It was this box. He admitted himself into the garden and hence into the wooden shed, and he went straight to this black box. And looks like this is a sort of electrical appliance, and the top of the box is open. So Klosner bent down and started working in it. But what was there exactly inside that black box? As it's mentioned, there were lots of wires of different colors, and there were also silver tubes. So in which kind of an appliance you see these materials? Of course, in an electrical appliance. In any electrical appliance, if you open that particular appliance, you'll see different colored wires which are meant for different purposes, and then there are these tubes. Now they may be capacitors, they may be some kind of ray tubes, and Klosner started playing with them, meaning adjusting them or fixing them wherever it was needed. He picked up a piece of paper that lay beside the box, studied it carefully, put it down, peered inside the box and started running his fingers along the wires, tugging gently at them to test the connections, glancing back at the paper, then into the box, and then at the paper again, checking each wire. He did this for perhaps an hour. Now, from these lines, it is very clear that Klosner is trying to build something, and it looks like that is an electrical appliance. Klosner has a diagram in place, which perhaps he might have drawn before creating this appliance. So there is a piece of paper beside this black box on which a diagram is made. A schematic diagram is made, where the wires have to be connected, where the things have to be, where the tubes have to be placed, so on and so forth. All the details are there on the paper, which is lying beside the box. Now Klosner wants to make sure that it is going according to the plan. Klosner wants to make sure that the diagram matches his creation. So he is constantly validating all that is inside the box to the diagram by looking at the paper and then looking at the box, by looking at the paper and the diagram again and again looking at the box. He kept on doing this for 1 hour. Then he put a hand around to the front of the box where there were 3 dials and he began to twiddle them, watching at the same time the movement of the mechanism inside the box. So here we get to know that the front of the box was laden with dials. There were 3 dials right in front of the box, just like you have it in a radio where you can adjust frequencies. So Klosner was moving those dials and checking to see if there was any movement inside the box. He was checking to see if the movement was exactly how he expected. All the while he kept speaking softly to himself, nodding his head, smiling sometimes, his hands always moving, the fingers moving swiftly, deftly inside the box, his mouth twisting into curious shapes when a thing was delicate or difficult to do, saying, "Yes, yes, and now this one. Yes, yes. What is this, right? Is it? Where's my diagram? Ah, yes, of course. Yes, yes, that's right. And now. Good, good. Yes, 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 yes." So here Klosner is involved in a lot of self-talk. He is dealing with delicate and minute things inside the box. And so he is carefully adjusting things inside. He is very cautiously moving his fingers and agreeing and disagreeing to his own self by looking at the diagram. And at the same time, he's making some curious and wild expressions. His concentration was intense. His movements were quick. There was an air of urgency about the way he worked, of breathlessness, of strong, suppressed excitement. So here we can imagine that Klosner was involved into something unique. It may be something that no one has attempted before, and he really wanted to get this done. What was he trying to do? Which kind of appliance was he trying to make? That is not mentioned here so far, but we will find it out. From these lines we also know that Klosner was totally focused and engrossed in his task. He was so engrossed that sometimes he would go breathless. He was excited and his movements were quick and fast because he wanted to see the result as soon as possible. Suddenly he heard footsteps on the gravel path outside, and he straightened and turned swiftly as the door opened and a tall man came in. It was Scott. It was only Scott, the doctor. Now friends, the road that led to this little wooden shed was made of stones, and so if anybody walked on it, one could easily hear the footsteps. So Klosner, although he was very engrossed in his own work, his concentration was intense, he heard some footsteps and he turned behind to see who came inside his little wooden shed. But when he saw this man called Scott, he was relaxed. Why? Because Scott was the doctor to whom Klosner once upon a time went for a checkup. Well, 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 the doctor said. So, this is where you hide yourself in the evenings. Hello, Scott, Klosner said. I happened to be passing, the doctor told him, so I dropped in to see how you were. There was no one in the house, so I came on down here. How's the throat of yours been behaving? Now, this doctor, Dr. Scott, was passing through the same route where Klosner's house was located, and he was reminded of a patient called Klosner who had once visited him for some kind of a throat ache or a throat pain. And because the doctor was passing by, he said Why don't I check up Klosner? Why don't I visit Klosner and see if he was doing alright? So the doctor also entered through the front gate. He entered the house. He looked everywhere, but Klosner was not there inside the house. So he came out of the house, went to the garden, and went inside this wooden shed, and there he was. And so the doctor asked if Klosner hid himself in the evenings in the wooden shed. It's alright, it's fine. Now I'm here, I might as well have a look at it. Please don't trouble. I'm quite cured, I'm fine. The doctor began to feel the tension in the room. He looked at the black box on the bench. Then he looked at the man. You've got on your hat. You've got your hat on, he said. Of course, friends, if you are involved into something very interesting, if you are totally into a task that you love, that you like, that is your obsession, you don't want anyone to distract you. And so this particular doctor was a sort of distraction for Klosner, because he was trying to fix things inside the box. He was trying to achieve something which is very unique. Now here the doctor is first of all interrupting and asking questions about Klosner's throat. Klosner doesn't want to waste time in replying him. So when the doctor asks, "Hey Klosner, how's your throat?" Klosner says, "It's alright, I'm just fine. Don't bother." And from the way Klosner replied to the doctor realized that Klosner was tensed. And because Scott is a doctor, he started observing things around. He started to figure out all the reasons that might be making him tense. So first of all, he looks at Klosner and he looks at his head and says, "Hey, you still have your hat on." "Oh, have I?" Klosner reached up, removed the hat and put it on the bench. The doctor came up closer and bent down to look into the box. "What's this?" he said. "Making a radio?" "No, just fooling around. It's got rather complicated looking innards." "Yes." Klosner seemed tense and distracted. "What is it?" the doctor asked. "It's rather a frightening looking thing, isn't it?" "It's just an idea." "Yes, it has to do with sounds, that's all." Now Klosner really and badly wanted to start his work inside the box, and so he didn't even think of removing his hat. In fact, he had completely forgotten about the hat. He had forgotten that he should have removed the hat once he came to the wooden shed. Now the doctor peeked inside this particular black box and then started asking all kind of questions. The doctor observed that here there is a black box with a lot of different colored wires and tubes, and there are so many tools around, and the front of the box also has dials. And so the doctor asks, "Klosner, are you making a radio? Whatever you are dealing with looks complicated." And as I said, Klosner did not want to waste time in explaining the doctor, so he was giving small and brief answers. But the doctor is hell-bent on knowing what Klosner was dealing with, so he keeps on asking questions. So Klosner keeps on giving small answers. First of all, he says yes, then he says it's just an idea, then he says this has to do something with sound, nothing else. Good heavens, man, don't you get enough of that sort of thing all day in your work? I like sound. So it seems. The doctor went to the door, turned and said, "Well, I won't disturb you. Glad your throat's not worrying you anymore." But he kept standing there, looking at the box, intrigued by the remarkable complexity of its inside, curious to know what this strange patient of his was up to. "What is it really for?" he asked. "You have made me inquisitive." Now Klosner told the doctor that he liked sound, and hence he liked to build electrical appliances that deal with sound. This doctor knew where Klosner worked, and so he says, "Don't you get all kind of things? Don't you deal with electrical equipments all day long at your workplace? Even at your workplace you're dealing with these things, and when you're at your own house you're again dealing with these things." Klosner again said, "I like sound, and so I keep on dealing with these things." The doctor realized that he should leave. He should not bother Klosner anymore, depending on the answers that he was giving. So he goes to the door of the wooden shed, but then he again turns back to Klosner and said some final words. Before leaving, he said, "I'm happy that your throat is okay, and I don't want to disturb you anymore." But even after saying that, he is still standing there at the door. He isn't leaving. And once again, he asks Klosner, "What is this device? What are you dealing with? What are you trying to create? You have really made me curious." Klosner looked down at the box, then at the doctor. and he reached up and began gently to scratch the lobe of his right ear. There was a pause. The doctor stood by the door, waiting and smiling. "All right, I'll tell you if you're interested." There was another pause, and the doctor could see that Klosner was having trouble about how to begin. Now, Klosner realized that the doctor is not going to leave unless he gets a satisfactory answer about this black box. So, he thought of replying the doctor. He thought of explaining the doctor everything that he was dealing with. So, he started formulating some sort of answer for the doctor. He looks at the box and then at the doctor, and he's wondering, what should I explain this man? Will he really understand? So while he was formulating his answer, and you know this very well, when a person is nervous there are some strange movements. So here Klosner is also making some strange movements. He is trying to reach out his ear and scratch his earlobe, and then he's taking a pause. And while all of this was going on, the doctor is standing there waiting and smiling. He's waiting for an answer. By now, Klosner has made up his mind that he will explain the doctor about the box and about everything that he was dealing with. But again, Klosner was wondering if the doctor would understand. So he was taking lots of pauses, and all of this was seen by the doctor. He was still there at the door, and he had not left. He was shifting from one foot to the other, tugging at the lobe of his ear, looking at his feet, and then at last, slowly he said, "Well, it's like this. The theory is very simple, really. The human ear, you know that it cannot hear everything. There are sounds that are so low-pitched or so high-pitched that it cannot hear them. Now, this is a quality of a person who is nervous. If you were nervous on stage, you would remember that you were moving from one feet to the other. Or if your friend was not a very good public speaker, and if somebody had pushed him on the stage, you would have noticed that your friend had started making some movements. But in Klosner's case, it is a little different. Klosner is trying to build something unique, and here we have a stranger, here we have a doctor who wants to understand his concept, who wants to understand his idea. Now Klosner is also formulating the answer, at the same time wondering if the doctor would understand. So he starts by telling the doctor that it was plain simple, it was very simple. Klosner had simplified his answer. He starts by telling the doctor that you are already aware that a human ear does not hear all the sounds that exist in the universe. Klosner told the doctor that there are sounds which are very low pitched and which are very high pitched, which are inaudible to the human ear. Klosner starts by explaining the doctor that there is a fixed bandwidth of sounds that are audible to us humans. Not everything we can hear. The doctor agrees to him, says, yes. The doctor said, yes. Well, speaking very roughly, any note so high that it has more than 15,000 vibrations a second, we cannot hear it. Dogs have better ears than us. You know you can buy a whistle whose note is so high-pitched that you cannot hear it all. Cannot hear it at all. But a dog can hear it. Now here Klosner is talking about sound waves and the vibrations associated with each wave. To explain you better, you can already see on my screen the diagram for a low-pitched sound and the diagram for a high-pitched sound. You can see that the high-pitched sound has more number of waves. This is exactly what Klosner is explaining the doctor. So if there are 15,000 waves in 1 second, Klosner says we cannot hear that sound, but dogs can. And then he talks about a whistle that is available in the market. The whistle, if you buy it and if you blow that whistle, which is especially meant for dogs, the sound that it produces cannot be heard by humans. Only dogs can hear such sounds. The doctor says, yes, I have seen one. Klosner continues, of course you have. And up the scale higher than the note of that whistle, there is another note, a vibration if you like. But I prefer to think of it as a note. You can't hear that one either. And above that, there is another and another rising right up the scale for ever and ever and ever. An endless succession of notes, an infinity of notes. There is a note, if only our ears could hear it, so high that it vibrates 1,000,000 times a second, and another 1,000,000 times as higher as that, and on and on and on, higher and higher as far as numbers go, which is infinity, eternity beyond the stars. Klosner says, of course you would have seen that whistle which I'm talking about. And then he talks about the higher pitched sounds, the sounds which have higher notes, which have more than 15,000 vibrations. Klosner explains the doctor that these are the kinds of sounds which you cannot hear, and the pitch goes higher and higher. The number of waves which we saw in the diagram keeps on increasing, and Klosner says it is endless. The notes keep on progressing, the notes keep on succeeding, one on top of the other, and it can go up to infinity, Klosner explains. He says only a human ear cannot hear all these sounds, otherwise there are notes with vibrations as far as 1,000,000 times in a second. Then on top of that, there is even a higher pitched sound, another 1,000,000 times as high as the previous one. And Klosner says it goes higher and higher and higher, as far as numbers can go, up to infinity or eternity. It can go also beyond the stars. Klosner was becoming more and more animated every moment. He was a small, frail man, nervous and twitchy, with always moving hands. His large head inclined towards his left shoulder, as though his neck were not quite as strong enough to support it rigidly. Now friends, we know that this was a subject in which Klosner was deeply interested, which is sounds. And if you talk about the subject in which you are deeply interested, you absolutely love talking about it. And so was Klosner. He was explaining his own concept and his passion for sounds and the existence of sounds, and this was clearly seen from his gestures and body movements. And the next lines explain the appearance of this person called Klosner. Was he strong and tall? Absolutely not. He was fragile and a thin man. He was always nervous and constantly moving, twitching his body. His hands would always move, and then his head was large and inclined towards his left shoulder, and it looked as if his neck is not strong enough to support his large head on that frail and thin body. Next, his face was smooth and pale, almost white, and the pale grey eyes that blinked and peered from behind a pair of steel spectacles were bewildered, unfocused, remote. Was he handsome? Was he good looking? No, he was pale. So if a person is ill, his face becomes pale, her face becomes white and lifeless. So therefore it's written almost white. And what about the eyes? His eyes were also grey in color, and he was wearing steel spectacles, and it looked as if his eyes were poking right through these spectacles. And looking at his eyes, one could easily say that the person is confused, or maybe unfocused, or maybe lost. He was a frail, nervous, twitchy little man, a moth of a man, dreamy and distracted, suddenly fluttering and animated. And now the doctor, looking at that strange pale face and those pale grey eyes, felt that somehow there was about this little man a quality of distance, of immense, immeasurable distance, as though the mind were far away from where the body was. So from the above lines, we already can imagine how Klosner would be looking. He was a thin man with a large head, and he was wearing spectacles, and most importantly he was twitchy, meaning he was twitching his body, constantly moving his arms and moving his body in an unknown direction and throwing some weird gestures. And the man was always daydreaming, always thinking about something, and was distracted, looking here and there and paying attention to different things at a time. And the doctor observed that all of a sudden he had become animated. But the most important thing that the doctor realized is, although Klosner was different, unique, strange and weird, he had a brain of a genius. His brain was that of a master. The doctor realized that Klosner's brain was far more developed than his body. The doctor waited for him to go on. Klosner sighed and clasped his hands tightly together. I believe, he said, speaking more slowly now, that there is a whole world of sound about us all the time that we cannot hear. It is possible that up there in those high-pitched inaudible regions there is a new exciting music being made with subtle harmonies and fierce grinding discords, a music so powerful that it would drive us mad if only our ears were tuned to hear the sound of it. There may be anything, for all we know, there may... Yes, the doctor said, but it's not very probable. Klosner had got the attention of the doctor. The doctor had become even more curious listening to Klosner's introduction and answers about what he was trying to achieve. Klosner continued his answer, making weird gestures, and this time he was clasping his hands together. And then he tells Doctor that there is a world of sounds which we do not know. There is a world of sounds which we cannot hear. And then he talks about the high-pitched inaudible regions. He says it is very possible that there is a region in this universe, in this world, where some sort of music is being played and we are unaware. Just because we cannot hear, just because those high-pitched sounds are inaudible to us, it is fairly possible that somebody is playing a nice music which is high in pitch and somebody is trying to create a very powerful music. Klosner says if only we were able to hear those sounds, we would absolutely go mad. The doctor finds all of this very fictional, and so he says, whatever you're talking is alright, but it's not possible. There is a very less possibility of the existence of the high-pitched inaudible world that you are talking about. Now Klosner doesn't seem very convinced with the doctor's response, so he says, why not? Why not? Klosner pointed to a fly sitting on a small roll of copper wire on the workbench. You see that fly? What sort of a noise is that fly making right now? None that one can hear. But for all we know, the creature may be whistling like mad on a very high note, or barking or croaking or singing a song. It's got a mouth, hasn't it? It's got a throat. Now there was a fly sitting on one of the tools on Klosner's workbench. Klosner disagrees to the doctor and says, do you see that fly? Do you know whether it is talking or singing or making some sort of sound? You do not know because you cannot hear what the fly is trying to tell you. It may be whistling like a crazy person. It may be croaking like a frog. It may be singing. Do you know? Are you aware? No, because all these sounds are inaudible to us. And the fly has got a mouth. It has got a throat. So obviously it will be making some sort of sound. It might be shouting or yelling, or it may be barking. The doctor looked at the fly and he smiled. He was still standing by the door with his hand on the doorknob. Well, he said, so you're going to check up on that? Now here the Dr. Scott already knows that Klosner is crazy. What Klosner says is impossible and improbable, and therefore he looks at the fly and he smiles. He did not completely reject Klosner's idea, and also he wants to leave, but he has the doorknob in his hand and tries to reach to a conclusion and asks, are you going to check if we can hear those sounds which are inaudible? Are you trying to create a device which will help us hear those sounds? Some time ago, Klosner said, I made a simple instrument that proved to me the existence of many odd inaudible sounds. Often I have sat and watched the needle of my instrument recording the presence of sound vibration in the air when I myself could not hear anything. I myself could not hear nothing. And those are the sounds I want to listen to. I want to know where they come from and who or what is making them. Now Klosner responded the doctor by going back to his past. He said, once upon a time I had made an instrument, a similar instrument with needles and dials and different wires and silver tubes. And with that instrument itself, I was able to see the movement of a needle when the atmosphere had a sound which I myself could not hear, said Klosner. My device showed me the presence of an inaudible sound. And then he tells the doctor that those sounds are of a great interest to him and he is interested deeply to listen to those sounds which a human ear cannot listen. And that machine on the table there, the doctor said, is that going to allow you to hear these noises? The doctor asked Klosner if the machine that he was trying to make at the moment was the machine which would help Klosner listen to the inaudible sounds. Was that his mission? Asked the doctor. It may. Who knows? So far I've had no luck, but I've made some changes in it and tonight I'm ready for another trial. This machine, he said, touching it with his hands, is designed to pick up sound vibrations that are too high-pitched for a reception by the human ear and to convert them to a scale of audible tones. I tune it in almost like a radio. Klosner replied to the doctor by saying that this is exactly what I'm trying to do. This black box and this complicated device that you're seeing on my workbench will pick up all the sounds that are inaudible to a human ear, which are too high-pitched for a human ear, and it will convert all those sounds into the sounds that any human being can hear. And to accomplish that, I will be tuning this device just like we tune a particular radio to a fixed frequency. How do you mean? The doctor asked. How would you do that? Klosner replied and said, it isn't complicated. Say I wish to listen to the squeak of a bat. That's a fairly high-pitched sound, about 30,000 vibrations a second. The average human ear cannot quite hear it. Now, if there were a bat flying around this room and I tune into 30,000 on my machine, I would hear the squeaking of the bat very clearly. I would even hear the correct note, F sharp or B flat or whatever it might be, but merely at a much lower pitch. Don't you understand? Now, those of you who are involved in music and learning maybe instruments like guitar or a piano would be able to relate all these notes, F sharp or B flat. There is a high-pitched F sharp, there is also a low-pitched F sharp, similarly for B flat. So, the doctor asks Klosner about more and more details, and Klosner gives an example of the squeaking of a bat. When a bat squeaks, the sound that is created is very high-pitched. The sound that is created, the wave disturbance is 30,000 vibrations in 1 second. Klosner says, you cannot hear the bat squeaking. All I'm gonna do is I'm going to set 30,000 on my machine, and if during that moment any bat would squeak, my machine would convert the high-pitched squeaking into the one that is low-pitched and give me an output which I will hear it on my headphones. Don't you understand? Asks Klosner to the doctor. The doctor knows that this is very complicated, but still he has a little bit of hope in what he is doing. So the doctor looked at the long black coffin box and asked, and are you going to try it tonight? Yes. Well, I wish you luck. He glanced at his watch. My goodness, he said, I must fly. Goodbye, and thank you for telling me. I must call again sometime and find out what happened. The doctor went out and closed the door behind him. So here, as we already know, the doctor is standing near the door with the door knob in his hands. He is patiently listening to Klosner. He wanted to know what Klosner was up to, what he was dealing with, and Klosner gave the in-depth details. The doctor asked if Klosner was going to accomplish this tonight. Klosner said, yes, I am going to tune in my machine to inaudible frequencies, inaudible sounds, and I will myself hear those sounds when my machine, the black box that you see, will convert them into the low pitched sounds. And then the doctor realizes that he is late, he had to reach somewhere. And then he tells Klosner to let him know whatever happens, to let him know if Klosner was really able to hear all those high pitched inaudible sounds. And the doctor leaves and closes the door behind him. For a while longer, Klosner fussed about with the wires in the black box. Then he straightened up and in a soft, excited whisper said, "Now we'll try again. We will take it out into the garden this time, and then perhaps the reception will be better." So the doctor left and Klosner is all alone once again. He continued what he was doing. He was again validating his creation with the diagram, and he was almost done and kept on correcting things inside the box. And finally, whatever he had decided was accomplished. The machine was ready. He tried to see from inside of his wooden shed if he could hear those inaudible sounds. He was unsuccessful, so he thought of trying again. This time he thought of going outside from the wooden shed into the garden. He thought the reception might be better because it is an open space. Let's go to the garden and see if he is able to hear those inaudible sounds. Lift it up now, carefully. Oh my god, it's heavy. He carried the box to the door, found that he couldn't open the door without putting it down. Carried it back, put it on the bench, opened the door, and then carried it with some difficulty into the garden. So Klosner's creation, Klosner's device was completely ready. Now he had to test it. Now it was the time for experimentation. It was the time of trial and error. So he thought of placing this particular device into the garden somewhere. So he lifted the box and reached towards the door, but he realized that it was impossible to open the door because the appliance was very heavy. He had to place the box on the bench and then open the door and then take it back up. And finally, he reached the garden. He placed the box carefully on a small wooden table that stood on the lawn. He returned to the shed and fetched a pair of earphones. He plugged the wire connections from the earphones into the machine and put the earphones over his ears. The movements of his hands were quick and precise. He was excited and breathed loudly and quickly through his mouth. He kept on talking to himself with little words of comfort and encouragement, as though he were afraid. Afraid that the machine might not work, afraid also of what might happen if it did. Now friends, on the garden there was a small wooden table, and on the table he placed this particular device. Again, he realized that he needed headphones, so he went back into the wooden shed to get his earphones. He connected those to the machine and then put the earphones over his ears. And because this was his own unique creation, something that nobody ever thought of, something that nobody ever attempted, he was excited. He breathed quickly and loudly through his mouth, and he was trying to keep up the optimism, the positivity, by involving in self-talk. And he started thinking, what would I do if my machine responded? What would I do if I hear the inaudible sounds? What would I do if I did not hear those sounds? He stood there in the garden beside the wooden table, so pale, small, and thin that he looked like an ancient, consumptive, bespectacled child. The sun had gone down. There was no wind, no sound at all. So now Klosner was all set. He was ready to test his appliance in the garden. And he looked a little bit funny, because as we know, he was pale, he had a large head and thin body, and his height was not that great. He looked as if there's a child standing who is completely absorbed in himself and wearing glasses. Bespectacled, meaning one who wears glasses. And how's the weather outside his house? It is serene, it is calm, there is no wind, the sun set already. The sun had gone down already, and there was complete silence. From where he stood, he could see over a low fence into the next garden, and there was a woman walking down the garden with a flower basket on her arm. Now Klosner was very observant, so he watched her for a while without thinking about her at all. So Klosner brought the device from the wooden shed to the garden and on the table, and now he is observing everything that's around him. He is experiencing the silent weather. He is observing if there are any movements, if there are people around, and what are they up to. And now it was the time to begin. Then he turned to the box on the table and pressed a switch on its front. Now this particular switch might turn the appliance on. It may be an on-off switch that he might have designed. So he switched on the appliance, and then he put his left hand on the volume control and his right hand on the knob that moved a needle across a large central dial, like the wavelength dial of a radio. We know very well that Klosner was twitchy, meaning he was constantly moving, and here to try out his device and to check if it was working fine, he is using both his hands. He stood there in the garden beside the wooden table, so pale, small and thin that he looked like an ancient, consumptive, bespectacled child. Bespectacled is someone who is wearing specs. It was the time to test this device. So Klosner had taken this device out in the garden and placed it on the table, and he was wondering how to get started. He looked like a small child, consumed in his desires, one who was wearing steel spectacles. The sun had gone down. There was no wind, no sound at all. Klosner observed everything that was around his garden. It was evening time and the sun had set already, and it was absolutely peaceful. There was pin-drop silence. Why? Because there was no wind, no sound from any source. From where he stood, he could see over a low fence into the next garden. There was a woman walking down the garden with a flower basket on her arm. Now friends, we know that Klosner's device will pick up all the sounds that are high-pitched, convert them into low-pitched, and present it to Klosner. Klosner was ready to test this device, and he had brought this particular device into his garden so that the reception increases. The garden would have many insects and many trees and many living entities and non-living entities which might produce some sound. And by that, Klosner would be able to successfully test this device. Now, Klosner observed everything that was around his garden as we discussed. First of all, he noticed and experienced that there was pin-drop silence. Then he turned around because there was some movement. His neighbors, and especially the lady next door, was clearly visible from where he was standing. The lady was carrying a flower basket hanging on her hands. The fence between the two houses was not that heighted, and so it was easily visible. He watched her for a while without thinking about her at all. Then he turned to the box on the table and pressed a switch on its front. Now Klosner at this moment is not thinking anything. He is just observing. He is just looking around with all his senses. The observation was now complete. It was the time to turn on the machine. There was a switch on the front panel of the box which was used to turn on the machine. Klosner turned this device on. He put his left hand on the volume control and his right hand on the knob that moved the needle across a large central dial, like the wavelength dial of a radio. We know that Klosner is hyperactive. He is twitchy and always moving. So here he is using both his hands. Left hand to adjust the volume and right hand to move the needle, or we can say to adjust the needle by moving the dial, just like we do it in the radio. The dial was marked with many numbers in a series of bands starting at 15,000 and going on up to 10 lakh. Now friends, this sentence tells us about the frequency bands that this machine could grab. This machine could easily pick up frequencies or sound waves with vibrations as high as 15,000 per second up to 10 lakh vibrations per second. And now he was bending forward over the machine. His head was cocked onto one side in a tense listening attitude. His head was cocked to one side in a tense listening attitude. His right hand was beginning to turn the knob. The needle was traveling slowly across the dial, so slowly he could hardly see it move, and in the earphones he could hear a faint spasmodic crackling. Spasmodic is something that is not continuous. Just like he did while he was fixing his machine, again he bent over to the machine. He had put his earphones on and he had activated his senses to listen everything that he could. We know that his head was already tilted on one side, but this time it was meant to listen carefully, to listen to all the sounds that the machine would produce. Now, he started adjusting the frequencies by turning the knob. At the same time, he was also observing the needle on the central dial. If for a particular frequency it moved, he should hear a sound. But what's going on here? The needle was not moving that rapidly. The needle was slowly moving across the dial. Was he able to hear the high frequency sounds? No, he could only hear a little bit of crackling, and that too was not very clear. Behind this crackling sound, he could hear a distant humming tone, which was the noise of the machine itself. But that was all. Contrary to his expectation, he could not hear anything great. He could hear spasmodic crackling, meaning short and discontinued sounds accompanied with humming tone. And he knew that the machine itself is producing this tone. It is not coming from any external source or any external entity. We know that he was listening very, very carefully. And as he listened, he became conscious of a curious sensation, a feeling that his ears were stretching out away from his head, that each ear was connected to his head by a thin, stiff wire, like a tentacle, and that the wires were lengthening, that the ears were going up and up towards a secret and forbidden territory, a dangerous ultrasonic region where ears had never been before and had no right to be. Of course, and why not? Klosner is trying to listen to sounds which are inaudible to a human ear, and he has become so curious and so focused and so engrossed in listening that he has started having some weird imaginations. He feels as if his ears are connected by a thin wire, and the length of the wire was increasing constantly, and that his ears were entering a region where human ear should not be entering. That is the ultrasonic region, which is considered dangerous. Metaphorically speaking, Klosner's hearing senses, Klausner's hearing power was all-time high while he was testing his device. Next sentence. The little needle crept slowly across the dial, and suddenly he heard a shriek, a frightful, piercing shriek, and he jumped and dropped his hands, catching hold of the edge of the table. So what happens when you're listening to soft music and suddenly somebody calls you up and a blaring ringtone is heard from your headphones? Do you get scared? The same thing happened with Klosner. Imagine Klosner being very attentive and focused. He was not hearing any specific sound so far, but at the same time, his listening powers were all-time high. But all of a sudden, he hears a shriek, a yell, a scream, and that scream is depicting fear. The scream is so high-pitched and so scary that Klosner himself lost balance. He had to quickly grab the table as he got very scared of that shriek. He stared around him as if expecting to see a person who had shrieked. So after this incident, he started looking around as to who screamed. Was there a lady around? Was there any other human being? Was it an animal? Was it a thing? But what happened? There was no one in sight except the woman in the garden next door, and it was certainly not she. She was bending down, cutting yellow roses and putting them in her basket. Klosner, after hearing that shriek, looked around to see if somebody had yelled. But no, things were as they were before. There was no human being around, no animal, no particular source of sound. All he could see is the lady next door or the woman next door who was cutting some yellow roses from her garden and putting those roses into her basket. But Klosner wondered, did she scream? I don't think so. It's not possible because she looks calm and quiet. She is pleasantly picking up roses from a garden. How could have she screamed? Again it came, a throatless, inhuman shriek, sharp and short, very clear and cold. The note itself possessed a minor, metallic quality that he had never heard before. Klosner already heard the shriek once, and he looked around, he didn't find anything. But yet another time, there was this scream heard. It looked throatless and inhuman. It didn't seem as if it was coming out of a human throat. But still, one could easily identify the scream. It was not prolonged, it was sharp and brief. One could easily hear it. And it was cold. It was devoid of any certain emotions. The note itself possessed a minor metallic quality that he had never heard before. The scream had a metallic quality. Again, it means the same thing. One could tell that the scream was painful, but apart from that, there were no emotions that one could feel hearing the scream. Klosner looked around him, searching instinctively for the source of the noise. Because this incident repeated second time, Klosner started looking around impatiently to figure out who had screamed. From where did this noise come or generate? The woman next door was the only living thing inside. He saw her reach down, take a rose stem in the fingers of one hand and snip the stem with a pair of scissors. Again he heard the scream. Now Klosner thought of observing the only entity which was living and moving. It was none other than the woman. This time Klosner thought of observing her very carefully. What was she doing? She was bending down in one of the plants of a garden. She was taking a rose stem in her fingers and snipping them or cutting them with scissors. And as soon as this activity was done, the scream was heard very clearly in his headphones. It came at the exact moment when the rose stem was cut. Now Klosner knew where the sound was coming from. At this point, the woman straightened up, put the scissors in the basket with the roses and turned to walk away. So this is the third instance where Klosner is hearing the scream and his eyes are set on the woman who is plucking the roses. The woman naturally is unaware about Klosner's presence and she picks the flower and goes away, putting the scissors back into her basket. "Mrs. Saunders!" Klosner shouted, his voice shrill with excitement. "Oh, Mrs. Saunders!" And looking around, the woman saw her neighbor standing on his lawn. A fantastic, arm-waving little person with a pair of earphones on his head, calling to her in a voice so high and loud that she became alarmed. Now this was the Eureka movement for Klosner. He was thrilled and excited that his machine was working fine and that his machine had caught some high-pitched scream. He thought of sharing this with his neighbor, the lady who was picking up the roses. So he ran to his lawn near the fence and shouted her name. He started waving at her with his headphones still in his ears. And because he was excited and thrilled, his voice became louder. It was so loud that Mrs. Saunders became alarmed and shocked. "Cut another one, please, cut another one quickly." She stood still, staring at him. "Why, Mr. Klosner?" she said. "What's the matter?" Now Klosner isn't able to believe that the sound really came from the flowers and that his machine picked up the sound accurately. As an evidence and to test it once again, he asks the lady to cut the flower one more time. If the scream is heard, it will be confirmed that his device was working properly and that the scream had come from plucking the flower. So he insists Mrs. Saunders to cut one more rose. Mrs. Saunders is completely perplexed. She's completely perplexed, shocked and unable to believe. "Please do as I ask," he said. "Cut just one more rose." Mrs. Saunders had always believed her neighbor to be a rather peculiar person. Now it seemed that he had gone completely crazy. She wondered whether she should run into the house and fetch her husband. "No," she thought. "No, he's harmless. I will just humor him." "Certainly, Mr. Klosner, if you like," she said. She took her scissors from the basket, bent down and snipped another rose. Mr. Klosner's neighbor, Mrs. Saunders, knew very well that this person is an odd one out. The person is different and unique, different from the rest of the human beings. She was well aware. This time when Mr. Klosner called her so loudly, she thought that he is crazy. He was asking her to do some crazy things. Initially she thought she should call her husband, but then she looked at Mr. Klosner once again and thought about his request, and then she thought, let me mock him. He looks harmless. He is so thin and fragile. He cannot harm me. I will just make fun of him. So she did as he had insisted and she cut yet another rose. Again Klosner heard that frightful throatless shriek in the earphones. Again it came at the exact moment the rose stem was cut. He took off the earphones and ran to the fence that separated the two gardens. "All right," he said. "That's enough. No more. Please, no more." Now Klosner had established that the shriek is coming from cutting the flowers, because the generation of that yelling sound and the cutting of the rose was happening at the same time. That yell was being generated at the same exact moment, and it was evident. Klosner was convinced, so he removed his earphones and went to that lady. He reached near the fence that separated the two houses, and because the shriek was fearful, because the scream was painful, he insisted the lady not to cut any more roses. The woman stood there, a yellow rose in one hand, clippers in the other, looking at him. Now this woman, Mrs. Saunders, knows very well that Mr. Klosner is crazy. But she is becoming more and more perplexed. First, she became perplexed when Mr. Klosner asked her to pluck one rose. And after she did that, now he is asking her to cut no more. This is crazy. So she was shocked. She is unable to comprehend what Klosner is up to. And so she just stood there with rose in one hand and clippers in other hand, and she was just looking at him blindly. "I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. Saunders," he said. "Something that you won't believe." Now it was the time for Mr. Klosner to reveal his great secret to his neighbor, Mrs. Saunders. And he is very sure that the woman will not believe. He put his hand on top of the fence and peered at her intently through his thick spectacles. He knew that it's gonna take some energy and time to explain Mrs. Saunders what had happened. So he established himself very well. He made himself comfortable by placing his hand on the fence and then looked very keenly through his thick spectacles that he was wearing. And he goes, "You have this evening cut a basket full of roses. You have with a sharp pair of scissors cut through the stems of living things, and each rose that you cut screamed in the most terrible way. Do you know that, Mrs. Saunders?" Now, who would know that? Nobody would have thought in the wildest dreams that plants do yell. Obviously, Mrs. Saunders was unknown to this fact that Mr. Klosner had just discovered. He said, "Mrs. Saunders, I see you have a basket, and the basket is full of roses, but each and every rose screamed when it was plucked, and it screamed in the most painful way. Do you know that?" "No," she said, "I certainly didn't know that." "It happens to be true," he said. He was breathing rather rapidly, but he was trying to control his excitement. "I heard them shrieking. Each time you cut one, I heard a cry of pain, a very high-pitched sound, approximately 132,000 vibrations a second. You couldn't possibly have heard it yourself, but I heard it." Of course, Mrs. Saunders disagreed. In fact, she denied and said, "I didn't know that. I didn't know that flowers scream." Mr. Klosner assured her and said, "Yes, this is true." And because he was speaking out of excitement, he was running out of breath. He said, "Mrs. Saunders, I heard them scream. Every time you cut one flower, it yells in pain, and I heard it." And the high-pitched scream, the high-pitched sound, had 132,000 vibrations a second. So that is 132,000 vibrations per second. Then he said, "I know, you would not have heard it because it's not possible, but I heard it." "Did you really, Mr. Klosner?" She decided she would make a dash for the house in about 5 seconds. Mrs. Saunders is totally confused and out of words as well. She thought she would run to her house in next 5 seconds. "You might say," he went on, "that a rosebush has no nervous system to feel with, no throat to cry with. You would be right. It hasn't. Not like us anyway. But how do you know, Mrs. Saunders?" And here he leaned far over the fence and spoke in a fierce whisper. "How do you know that a rosebush doesn't feel as much pain when someone cuts its stem into two as you would feel if someone cut your wrist off with a garden shears? How do you know that? It's alive, isn't it?" Klosner already assumed what Mrs. Saunders was about to say, or what Mrs. Saunders might say. Klosner thought Mrs. Saunders might say something like, "Of course, the rosebush has no nervous system. It cannot feel anything. It doesn't have a throat. It cannot cry. It doesn't have a mouth." Klosner says, "Yes, you may be right, but how do you know? What proof do you have that plants do not scream?" And then he approaches the fence a little bit more, and then he starts whispering and asks a question. "What if somebody cuts your wrist off with some garden equipment? When you cut a rose bush with your scissor, it would be as good as someone cutting off your wrist with a garden equipment. You never know this would be happening," Klosner said. "It's alive, isn't it, Mrs. Saunders?" Now, hearing about cutting off wrists, Mrs. Saunders was certain that Mr. Klosner was becoming a threat. And so she said, "Yes, Mr. Klosner. Oh yes, and good night." Quickly she turned and ran up the garden to her house. Klosner went back to the table. He put on the earphones and stood for a while listening. Now friends, just because Klosner talked about cutting off of her wrists, she felt threatened, and now she thought it's better to go back to the house because this person is mad. So she ran back to the house. And this person, Klosner, who is unique and odd, he doesn't even realize that he actually threatened Mrs. Saunders. And so he casually goes back to the table where his machine was placed and started testing it once again. He put on his headphones and stood there for a while listening. He wanted to see if he can hear some more sounds like the one he heard a few minutes back. He could still hear the faint crackling sound and the humming noise of the machine, but nothing more. He bent down and took hold of a small white daisy growing on the lawn. He took it between thumb and forefinger and slowly pulled it upward and sideways until the stem broke. Now, we already know that Klosner was able to establish one fact, that whenever a rose is plucked, it produces a very high-pitched sound. But he really couldn't believe. He could not believe that plants can also yell when broken, and he wanted to be certain of this fact. So when he came back to the table, although he could not hear any more sounds, but only crackling and humming noise of the machine itself, he really wanted to test it one last time. Now, below the table on which the machine was placed, there was a small white daisy grown. Remember, he still had his headphones on. So, he thought of checking one last time if plants really made yelling sounds. So he took that beautiful daisy between the thumb and forefinger and pulled it very gently until the stem broke. He wanted to see if a yelling sound or a screaming, inhuman, metallic sound is heard. From the moment that he started pulling to the moment when the stem broke, he distinctly heard in the earphones a faint, high-pitched cry, curiously inanimate. So did Klosner hear any sound when he broke the stem of the little flower? Of course he did. He started hearing sounds right from the moment he started pulling the stem to the moment it broke. He heard a high-pitched sound, or you can say cry or a scream, but he was still curious. He wanted to hear that sound once again. He wanted to feel how that sound occurs. So he took another daisy and did it again. Once more he heard the cry, but he wasn't so sure now that it expressed pain. Now, because the scream which was heard was inanimate, it doesn't seem as if the scream was coming out of a throat. It did not seem human-like, and it was difficult to conclude whether the scream is exhibiting pain or joy or sadness or any other feeling. And therefore, when he took another daisy and cut its stem, he definitely heard the scream, but he wasn't sure of the feeling that the scream expressed. No, it wasn't pain, it was surprise. Or was it? It didn't really express any of the feelings or emotions known to a human being. It was just a cry, a neutral, stony cry, a single emotionless note expressing nothing. Klosner is in a deep confusion because a couple of moments back he stopped Mrs. Saunders from cutting any more flowers, thinking that the flowers were yelling in pain. Klosner was comparing the scream of the flower to that of a human being, because logically, when humans are in pain, they yell. We as humans express pain by screaming at times. So he thought, same must be the case with the flowers. But after hearing the scream again and again, now he was utterly confused. He could not ascertain if the scream expressed pain or surprise. He is still thinking. Depending on what sounds a particular human being makes, one can ascertain if the human being is sad, happy, joyful, if he or she is in agony. But the yell which was heard from cutting off the stem of the daisy seemed very neutral, stony and cold. Klosner thought that this particular scream is expressing nothing. It is completely devoid of any emotions. And then he thought it had been the same with the flower, or we can say roses. He had been wrong in calling a cry of pain. He had been wrong in calling it a cry of pain. A flower probably did not feel pain. It felt something else which we didn't know about, something called toin or spiral or plenukement or anything you like. Now Klosner is constantly comparing the yell of the plants to that of the human beings. Because when we as humans make a high-pitched sound, it indicates that we are either shouting out of joy or we are shouting out of pain. And we have termed this particular act as screaming. But Klosner, after a lot of reflection and introspection, has concluded that the plants are not feeling pain. Klosner isn't sure what they are trying to express. But at least at this moment, he is trying to term the scream made by the plants. He is giving his own names. The term can be toin or spurl or plenukement, etc. He stood up and removed the earphones. It was getting dark and he could see pricks of light shining in the windows of the houses all around him. Carefully, he picked up the black box from the table, carried it into the shed and put it on the workbench. Then he went out, locked the door behind him and walked up to the house. Now, for this particular day, all the thinking, all the thought process should come to an end, thought Klosner. Why? Because the sun had already set and now it was getting darker. He could see that people had already lit their house lights and now it was the time to go back home and carefully place his own creation into the desk of the wooden shed. And where exactly? On the workbench. So he placed his device very carefully back to the workbench inside the wooden shed, locked it nicely and then went back to his house. The next morning, Klosner was up as soon as it was light. He dressed and went straight to the shed. You know, when you're really excited about something, you want to start working on it as soon as you can. And the exact same thing happened with Klosner. Klosner not only thought about his creation, about sounds and how the machine responded all night long, but as soon as the sunrise unfolded, he opened his eyes, freshened up, dressed himself up and went straight to the shed to his machine. He picked up the machine and carried it outside, clasping it to his chest with both hands, walking unsteadily under its weight. Klosner knew very well that he could only test the machine not inside the wooden shed, but outside in the garden, in an open area where the reception will be maximum. So he picked up his machine and carried it out. He had to grab the machine tightly because there was so much inside. There were so many wires, there were so many tubes and whatnot. It had made the machine very heavy. So he had to have a good grip on the machine and carry it outside. But we know that Klosner was thin and a frail man, so he was walking unsteadily while he was carrying the big and heavy machine. He went past the house, out through the front gate and across the road to the park. Then he paused and looked around him, and then he went on until he came to a large tree, a beech tree, and he placed the machine on the ground close to the trunk of the tree. Now these sentences tell us the plan that Klosner had. What was the plan? Now the plan is not to test the machine inside his own garden. The plan is to take the machine, take the device into a park which was on the other side of his house. He was done testing with small plants. He had already listened to the screams of the stem of a rose plant. He had listened to the scream of the stem of a daisy plant, and now it was the time to deal with something bigger. Now, as he admitted himself into the park, he came across a tree. Now, this particular tree is called beech tree. Beech tree is found in America and Europe, and he instantly placed the machine at the trunk of that tree, closer to the trunk of the tree, closer to the tree on the ground. Next sentence. Quickly he went back to the house and got an axe from the coal cellar and carried it across the road into the park. He put the axe on the ground beside the tree. So, what's going on here? Klosner already had cut the stems of little plants with his own hands, and he listened to the screams of those plants. But now he wanted to listen to the scream or yell of a huge and strong tree. But for that, he would need an axe. So first of all, he needed a huge tree which was readily available inside the park opposite to his house across the road. And then to hear the scream, to hear the yell, he would need to break the tree somehow. Of course, that would need an axe. Now, at this point, he had placed this machine beside the tree or close to the tree, but now he needed an axe. So he ran back to the house and he knew that he had an axe in the coal cellar. What is a cellar? Cellar is a place to store things. So inside his house, he had a place to store coal, and that's the place where the axe was placed. He quickly got that axe as well. Then he looked around him again, peering nervously through his thick glasses in every direction. There was no one about. It was 6 in the morning. Now Klosner had a master plan. The master plan was to get up very early, rush to the park which was across his house, and then try to cut one big tree and see how the machine responds to the sounds made by that tree. It is fairly possible that somebody objects him for cutting a tree. It is fairly possible that maybe a police or a cop arrests him for cutting a strong tree and creating disturbance. And therefore, Klosner made sure that nobody was watching. Klosner looked through his thick spectacled eyes, and that too in every direction. He wanted to prove that his machine really worked, and for that, he was ready to do just about anything. He put the earphones on his head and switched on the machine. He listened for a moment to the faint familiar humming sound. Then he picked up the axe, looked a stance with his legs wide apart, and swung the axe as he heard. Okay, let me reread. He put the earphones on his head and switched on the machine. He listened for a moment to the faint familiar humming sound. Then he picked up the axe, took a stance with his legs wide apart, and swung the axe as hard as he could at the base of the tree trunk. Plug in the headphones. Step number 3 was to ensure that the faint humming sound was heard from the machine itself. And now, it was a time to see how the tree responds to its breaking. Now again, because Klosner was not that strong, he had to widen his legs in order to strike the tree as hard as he could. And that's exactly what he did at the base of the tree trunk. The blade cut deep into the wood and stuck the tree there, and at the instant of the impact he heard a most extraordinary noise in the earphones. It was a new noise unlike any he had heard before. A harsh, noteless, enormous noise. A growling, low-pitched, screaming sound. Not quick and short like the noise of the roses, but drawn out like a sob, lasting for fully a minute, loudest at the moment when the axe struck, fading gradually fainter and fainter until it was gone. So, was Klosner able to strike the tree well, just as planned? Of course, because the blade cut very deep into the stem, or trunk we can say. It went so much inside the tree trunk that Klosner was unable to take it out. The axe was stuck inside. And what about the sound that Klosner heard? Klosner, as soon as he struck the tree, he heard the most extraordinary, the most unique sound, something that he had heard never before in his headphones. Now this sound was not short and quick like he heard when he cut the stem of the roses, but the sound produced was literally a scream, like a growling animal. It was noteless, it was enormous and gigantic. It felt as if somebody cried in pain. And how long was that sound? It was so long that it lasted for fully a minute. And then gradually it started fading, and completely gone. Klosner stared in horror at the place where the blade of the axe had sunk into the wood flesh of the tree. Then gently he took the axe handle, worked the blade loose, and threw the thing on the ground. Listening to the horrific yell of the tree, one thing was clear to Klosner, that the tree did yell in pain. The extreme pain was felt to the beautiful tree, and Klosner felt absolutely guilty about it. He stared in horror. He looked at the blade and saw how it was sunk into the trunk of the tree. At this moment, he is thinking of the tree trunk as wood flesh just because it made a huge growling sound, just like any human would made if somebody put an X on one of the human parts. Now he started hating the X and started feeling a lot of guilt. So very gently, very calmly and very generously, he removed the X through the handle and threw away the thing called X onto the ground. With his fingers he touched the gash that the X had made in the wood, touching the edges of the gash, trying to press them together to close the wound, and kept saying, "Tree, oh tree, I am sorry. I am so sorry. But it will heal. It will heal fine." Klosner started having a lot of sympathy, or we can say empathy, for that beautiful tree to whom he had just made a bruise mark, to whom he wounded badly. And now he started consoling the tree as if it were a human by saying something like, "Dear tree, please forgive me. I am so sorry of what I did. But I assure you that your wound will heal. Please forgive me. I am guilty. I am so sorry." And while speaking, he was touching the wound gently. In short, he started behaving with the tree as if it were a human being just wounded. For a while he stood there with his hands up on the trunk of the great tree. Then suddenly he turned away and hurried off out of the park, across the road, through the front gate and back into his house. He kept hugging the tree for several minutes because, as I said, he was feeling very guilty. Now he could not bear the guilt anymore. So he turned away and ran off back to his house. But this had to be shared with someone. So he went to the telephone, consulted the book, dialed a number and waited. He held the receiver tightly in his left hand and tapped the table impatiently with his right hand. He heard the telephone buzzing at the other end, and then the click of a lifted receiver and a man's voice, a sleepy voice, saying, "Hello, yes?" Friends, as we know, it was just 6 a.m. in the morning. And very few people wake up during this hour. And we have a man here called Klosner who not only woke up very early, but he tested his device by hitting a beautiful tree and creating a wound on it successfully. And because he could not bear the guilt, he had to share it with someone so that he feels a little bit lighter and a little bit okay. In those days, we did not have WhatsApp or Facebook. We had a diary in which people used to write numbers. So in one of his diaries, there was a number of this doctor. And because the doctor had met him the day before, the news had to be shared with him as soon as possible. And as it's already written here, a sleepy voice responded, saying, "Hello, yes?" And on the other side is Klausner, fully energetic, thrilled and feeling guilty at the same time. He says, "Dr. Scott?" "Yes, speaking." "Dr. Scott, you must come at once. Quickly, please." "Who is it speaking?" "Klosner here. And you remember what I told you last night about my experience with sound and how I hoped I might—" Yes, of course. But what's the matter? Are you ill?" "No, I'm not ill, but—" "It's 6:30 in the morning," the doctor said. "And you call me, but you're not ill. Please come. Come quickly. I want someone to hear it. It's driving me mad. I can't believe it." Dr. Scott was sleeping, and when Klosner called him up, initially the doctor thought that Klosner has some sort of medical emergency. So initially he agreed and said, all right, I will come. But what's the matter? Are you not well? Are you having some sort of emergency?" Now friends, when you are terribly sleepy and somebody bothers you, you want to ignore that person anyhow. So when Klosner said, "No, I'm not ill," but the doctor cut him off and said, "Look, it's 6 a.m. in the morning and you are calling a doctor, you are troubling him, and then saying that you're alright, you are not ill." But Klosner insisted in a way that the doctor was forced to get out of his bed and come over to Klosner's house. Klosner had told the doctor that his results were driving him crazy. The doctor heard the frantic, almost hysterical note in the man's voice, the same note he was used to hearing in the voices of people who called up and said, "There's been an accident, come quickly." He said slowly, "You really want me to get out of bed and come over now?" "Yes, now, at once, please." "All right then, I'll come." Now, frantic means driven out of anxiety and fear, and hysterical means a person cannot control his excitement or thrill or emotions. So Klosner's voice sounded something like he was driven with fear and anxiety. At the same time, he was unable to control his emotions. Now, thousands of people used to call this doctor and say that there has been an accident and that the doctor should come over to the place immediately. The doctor felt the same thing, as if there was an accident somewhere and that needed the doctor's presence ASAP. Now, the doctor knew that Klosner was not a normal person. He was not an average person. Klosner was the odd one out. So he again asked Klosner, "Klosner, do you really want me to get out of my bed? Because I am sleeping fine. It's cozy and I am in the middle of my sleep. Do you really want me to get out of my bed, get ready and come to you?" Klosner did not think while responding. He said, "Yes, doctor, please come right now." And the doctor, because he was also inquisitive and curious about the machine, he said, "All right, I will come down." Klosner sat down beside the telephone and waited. He tried to remember what the shriek of the tree had sounded like, but he could not. He could only remember that it had been enormous and frightful, and that it had made him feel sick with horror. Now Klosner already had called up the doctor. The doctor was getting fresh and was getting ready to come to Klosner's house, and Klosner was terribly impatient. While he was waiting for the doctor, he started recalling how the tree had yelled. He was trying to imagine and visualize the exact sound made by the tree. But as we know, the sound that was coming out of the machine that was made by the trees was not human-like. It was not coming out of a throat. It was an animated sound, metallic, stony and cold. So it was difficult for Klosner to recall that sound, to recall that scream, and all that he could remember was the feelings that were aroused in him while he heard those sounds, while he heard the growling and screaming of that tree. And why could he remember those feelings so well? Because the growling had made him sick with horror. The growling had instilled guilt in him, and the yelling of that tree had made him frightful. He tried to imagine what sort of a noise human would make if he had to stand anchored to the ground while someone deliberately swung a small sharp thing at his leg so that the blade cut in deep and wedged itself in the cut. Same sort of noise, perhaps? No, quite different. Now friends, right from the moment Klosner heard the sound of the breaking of a rose stem, he had started comparing the scream or the yell of the stem to that of a human being, because he also told Mrs. Saunders that what if somebody cut off your wrists? The same is felt by these plants. When Klosner himself broke the stem of a daisy flower, he was thinking the same thing. What if a body part of a human being was cut? How would the human being scream or yell? Would it be similar? And right now he had experimented with a tree, and he is thinking, what if somebody was made to stand on the ground with his or her feet buried a little bit inside the ground, and what if somebody axed that person, or maybe poked that person with a very sharp tool? what would be that person's reaction? Then Klosner is thinking, would it be the same? Would the person growl just like the tree? Or would it be different? Would that person make same sort of noise? The noise of the tree was worse than any known human noise because of that frightening, toneless, throatless quality. Now, Klosner thought about humans and how they cried in pain. He thought about all the human beings who might have been tortured, and he thought how they yelled during those times. And here he just heard the scream of a big tree. So he was constantly comparing the two screams. But in the case of the tree, it was frightening, toneless and throatless. It was even worse than any human scream. He began to wonder about other living things, and he thought immediately of a field of wheat standing up straight and yellow and alive with the mower going through it, cutting the stem 500 stems a second, every second. Oh my God, what would that noise be like? 500 wheat plants screaming together, and every second another 500 being cut and screaming. No, he thought, I do not want to go to a wheat field with my machine. I would never eat bread after that. But what about potatoes and cabbages and carrots and onions? What about apples? Ah, no. Here we know that Klosner is waiting for the doctor, but his mind is full of thoughts. His mind is exhausted with a lot of thoughts. Thoughts about other plants that are constantly cut for consumption. First thing he thought about was the wheat plantation. The mower is a device that cuts the wheat plants instantly, and that too in a bulk. And Klosner was aware about it. In 1 second, hundreds of wheat plants are cut, and in another second, another 100. And Klosner was imagining the scene, the situation, if his machine was brought to the wheat plantation, and if he was hearing those sounds made by the cutting of wheat stems, how horrific that would be. And then he decides that he will never ever visit the wheat plantations with his machine and with his headphones on. If the growling of the tree was this scary, how worse it would be in the wheat field, Klosner was thinking. 500 wheat plants screaming together in 1 second, then in another second, another 500 wheat plants, and so on and so forth. One growl had made Klosner crazy. What about 500 stems which are cut all together? What feelings would arise in Klosner's mind? He was thinking. And then he concludes that it would be definitely intolerable. And then he also thinks about potatoes, cabbages, carrots and onions and apples. He's thinking that each and every plant, each and every fruit plantation, in fact, would be making some or the other sort of noise in the form of screams or yells. And so, he discards the thought of bringing his machine to the plantations, whether it is fruit or vegetables. He says, I will never bring my machine to these fields and listen to the screams of these plants, because definitely they are crying in pain. He also decides that he will never eat bread, because bread is the outcome of wheat, and if the wheat stems experience so much pain, why to eat bread is what Klosner is thinking. Now he's thinking about apples here. He thinks apples are alright. They fall off naturally when they ripe. Apples are alright if you let them fall off instead of tearing them from the tree branch. But not vegetables. Not a potato, for example. A potato would surely shriek. So would a carrot and onion and cabbage. Now this is really interesting. He's thinking about all the fruits and vegetables that he usually consumes, and he thinks about apples. Now apples, when they ripe, they fall off, and therefore they would not scream. Thanks Klosner. And therefore it is okay to eat them. But to consume vegetables like potatoes, it would require potatoes to be pulled out from the ground, and therefore they would shriek or yell in pain, and therefore, according to the thought process of Klosner, potatoes should not be consumed henceforth. He heard the click of the front gate latch and he jumped up and went out and saw the tall doctor coming down the patch, a little black bag in hand. So we know that Klosner was thinking about all the plants and how they are cut and what kind of sounds they would be producing while waiting for the doctor. And now the doctor was here because he heard the sound from the front gate. And we know that Klosner was absolutely impatient. As soon as he heard the gate opening, he jumped out and went straight to the doctor, who was walking down the little path, and the doctor had a little bag in his hand. Now friends, the doctor is not in the right mood because Klosner woke him up, and that too when he was not ill. "Well," the doctor said, "well, what's all the trouble?" The doctor instantly asks Klosner, "It's 6 in the morning and you rang me up, so tell me now, what's the problem?" "Come with me, doctor, I want you to hear it. I call you because you're the only one I've told. It's over the road in the park. Will you come now?" Klosner impatiently told him what he wanted him to see. He urged the doctor to instantly hear what he had heard a few moments back. He said, "Dr. Scott, you're the only person with whom I have discussed about sound and about my device and what I was trying to achieve, and so I called you up. I have found something very interesting that I want you to know. It's right there, in the park, across the road. Will you please come with me right now?" Now, Dr. Scott is a good observer, and of course, he's a doctor. So, while he was talking to Klosner, Klosner seemed frantic and hysterical. But right now, he was calm. Maybe because of the thoughts he had while he was waiting for the doctor. Dr. Scott observed that there was no sign of madness or hysteria. He was just excited. It was clearly visible from his facial expression. He was disturbed as well and excited. Disturbed by what he had heard and excited for what he had to share with the doctor. They went across the road into the park and Klosner led the way to the great beech tree at the foot of which stood a long black coffin box of the machine and the X. It was now time to reveal to the doctor what Klosner had just observed. So Klosner took the doctor to the park, which was across the road opposite to his house. And we know that he had not carried the box back into the wooden shed. The black box was still there. It was heavy, and he thought, "I will wait for the doctor, show him the results, and when the doctor has heard it, I will take it back." So the box was still there, and the X was also lying on the ground. Klosner had threw the X on the ground, thinking it to be a very harmful and a very dangerous device because it had made a bruise mark on the tree, or we can say the wood flesh, and things were as they were. "Why did you bring it out here?" the doctor asked. Of course, the doctor had seen the wooden box inside the wooden shed on the workbench, and now looking at the box, looking at the coffin wooden black box, the doctor is wondering, "You have brought this box out in the park? Why is that so?" Klosner replies, "I wanted a tree. There aren't any big trees in the garden." "And why the X?" Now the doctor is full of questions. He is unable to believe what he is seeing. The box near the beech tree at its trunk, and the headphones, and the X. The doctor is constantly asking questions. And to that, Klosner replies, "I wanted a tree for my testing, for my experiments. I have a garden, but I don't have huge big trees. So I had to bring this box out in the park so that I could test the noise or screams made by a tree." And about the X, Klosner says, "You'll see it in a moment. Calm down. Give me some time. But now, please put on these headphones or earphones and listen. Listen carefully and tell me afterwards precisely what you hear. I want to make quite sure." Klosner stopped the doctor from asking any further questions. He just told the doctor to put the earphones on and requested the doctor to listen carefully what he hears over the earphones. Klosner wanted to make sure if the doctor also hears the same kind of sounds he heard, the same kind of growling, the same kind of loud scream, low-pitched scream which lasted for a minute and then faded. He wanted to make sure that what he heard was right and legitimate. The doctor smiled and took the earphones and put them over his ears. The doctor did exactly what Klosner said. Now, to a certain extent, the doctor doesn't believe Klosner. He was definitely fascinated when he heard Klosner's thoughts about sound, but now when he is looking at all the setup, the box and the X and the tree, he is a little bit skeptical, and therefore he smiles at Klosner and his intentions and still puts the headphones on. Klosner bent down and flicked the switch on the panel of the machine. This is the first step. Turn the switch on. Then he picked up the X and took his stance with his legs apart, ready to swing, just like it did when the doctor was absent. He is a thin man. He would need a lot of strength to swing the X, and so he widened his legs and he was ready to make another mark on the tree. For a moment he paused. "Can you hear anything?" he said to the doctor. "Can I what?" "Can you hear anything?" "Just humming noise." He wanted to make sure that the doctor also hears the humming noise and maybe a little bit of crackling which is made by the machine itself. He wanted to make sure that he is hearing the same thing as the doctor. So he asked if the doctor was also hearing the humming sound. To that the doctor said, "Yes, I am able to hear the humming noise." Klosner stood there with the X in his hands, trying to bring himself to swing, but the thought of the noise that the tree would make made him pause again. A couple of minutes back, he had made a bruise mark on the tree, and the tree had growled in pain. Now, the thought of that came to him while he was ready to swing the X to the trunk once again, the second time, for the doctor to ascertain that the tree was actually screaming. So, here the doctor looked at him and how he paused while he was trying to swing and asked, "What are you waiting for?" "Nothing," Klosner answered, and then he lifted the X and swung it at the tree. And as he swung, he could swear he felt a movement of the ground on which he stood. He felt a slight shifting of the earth beneath his feet, and as though the roots of the tree were moving underneath the soil. But it was too late to check. The blow and the X blade struck the tree and wedged deep into the wood. Eventually, Klosner hit the tree trunk once again, and that too as hard as he could. But here he felt something was wrong, because he felt some movement of the tree roots underneath the soil on which he was standing. He felt something is going on below the ground, and he could not even check if he really made a mark with the X on the tree trunk. And why is that so? Because at that moment, high overhead, there was the cracking sound of wood splintering and swishing sound of leaves brushing against other leaves, and they both looked up, and the doctor said, "Watch out! Run, man! Quickly run!" One of the branches of that big beech tree would have been loose, and so when Klosner hit the tree trunk once again, that particular branch, which was heavy, which was big, it completely disconnected itself from the tree, and so cracking sound was heard of the wood from above at a certain height. Now that branch came rushing down, and it was brushing itself with other branches and other fresh leaves, and so it also made swish sound. And obviously both of these fellows, the doctor and Klosner, looked up and realized the danger, and the doctor quickly shouted, "Run, run, quickly run!" Now who would stand there waiting for the branch to shatter the skull bones? Nobody would. So they both saved themselves and ran from the spot. The doctor had ripped off the earphones and was running away fast, but Klosner stood spellbound, standing up the great branch, 60 feet long at least, that was bending slowly downward, breaking and crackling and splintering at its thickest point, where it joined the main trunk of the tree. The doctor sensed that he was in danger, and so he ripped off the headphones, meaning removed the headphones, and started running away. But Klosner is still in observation mode. He's unable to realize that the branch would Kill him. And so he's observing how the great and nice branch, 60 feet long, very lengthy, long and beautiful branch, cracking up from the tree, slowly bending and disconnecting from the thickest point, where it was connected so nicely with the beech tree. The branch came crashing down and Klosner leapt aside just in time. It fell upon the machine and smashed it into pieces. Just when the great branch was about to shatter Klosner and kill him, Klosner stepped aside. But unfortunately, it shattered Klosner's creation, Klosner's coffin-like big black box which had wires and tubes and everything in it. It was shattered into pieces by this branch. "Great heavens!" shouted the doctor as he came running back. "That was a near one. I thought it had just got you." The doctor couldn't believe that Klosner stood there waiting for the branch to come upon him. And he was in deep shock. He approached Klosner and said, "I thought the branch is definitely gonna kill you. It was so close." He came running to Klosner and said this. Klosner was staring at the tree. His large head was leaning to one side and upon his smooth white face there was a tense, horrified expression. Now, when Klosner first hit the tree and made a mark with the X, he knew that he had given a lot of pain to the tree. And this was the second time. This time, not only he made another bruise mark on the tree, but he also broke a branch. Now, this is all very strange to the doctor, but for Klosner, it is as if he hurt a living thing which can feel. And right now, he is just standing there with his face tilted on one side, smooth white face tilted on one side, and the expression is horrified, shocked, and appalled. Slowly, he walked up to the tree and gently he prized the blade loose from the trunk. As if he hurt a human being, he walked up to the tree and removed the X from the mark that he had just made. He did all of this gently and generously because he knows that the tree would have shouted and screamed in pain. "Did you hear it?" he said, turning to the doctor. His voice was barely audible. The doctor was still out of breath from the running and the excitement. "Hear what?" "In the earphones, did you hear anything when the X struck?" The doctor began to rub the back of his neck. "Well," he said, "as a matter of fact," he paused and frowned and bit his lower lip. "No, I'm not sure. I couldn't be sure. I don't suppose I had the earphones on for more than a second after the X struck." Now, Klosner is least bothered of how the branch came crashing down and how both of them saved themselves. No, this is not important for Klosner. What's important is, did the doctor hear the sound? But what's important for the doctor? For the doctor, having saved his own life is important. So, when Klosner asked if he heard any screaming sound, the doctor said, "When you struck the tree with the X, I had to remove the headphones and run because the branch was loose. And I just had the earphones for not more than a second." He said this while he was annoyed and irritated and also out of breath. Yes, but what did you hear?" "I don't know," the doctor said. "I don't know what I heard. Probably the noise of the branch breaking." He was speaking rapidly, rather irritably. Now Klausner is expecting that the doctor would say something like, "Yes, I heard a scream. I heard a growling scream, a horrified and a frightful scream." But on the contrary, the doctor says, "I don't know what I heard. I just heard the branch breaking, and that too not from the headphones." What did it sound like? Klausner leaned forward slightly, staring hard at the doctor. Exactly what did it sound like? "Oh hell," the doctor said. "I really don't know. I was more interested in getting out of the way. Let's leave it." "Dr. Scott, what did it sound like? For God's sake, how could I tell? What with half the tree falling on me and having to run for my life?" Now friends, Klosner is hell-bent on knowing if the doctor heard the scream. But the doctor is irritated and he is annoyed for the fact that Klosner is least concerned about this incident of the branch falling. Instead, Klosner is asking some silly questions like what he heard from the headphones. And so the doctor is giving answers irritably. He said, "Hell, I don't know. I was just interested in saving my life. When the tree is falling on me, when half the tree is falling on me, how could I hear what was coming out of the headphones, he said. The doctor said, when I had to run for my own life, how could I hear what was given out by the headphones? And Klosner is furious because first of all his machine broke into pieces, and at the same time the doctor is not telling him if he heard anything satisfactory. The doctor certainly seemed nervous. Klosner had sensed it now. He stood quite still, staring at the doctor, and for fully half a minute he didn't speak. Now, after all this, after this little conversation and after this incident, Klosner was not realizing that the doctor didn't really care for the sound that was produced. The doctor cared for saving his own life. And Klosner now sensed that the doctor was nervous because he just had a tragic incident because of him. So, Klosner thought it's better not to speak for some time. This man is nervous from whatever happened. So he didn't speak anything for 30 seconds. The doctor moved his feet, shrugged his shoulders, and half turned to go. Well, he said, we'd better get back. All of this was nonsense for the doctor, and he didn't really want Klosner to be hurt. So he turned a little bit towards the house and hence the gate, and he said, it's better we go back to the house. Look, said the little man, and now his smooth white face became suddenly suffused with color. Look, he said, you stitch this up. He pointed to the last gash that X had made in the tree trunk. You stitch this up quickly. It is as if Klosner had built a personal relation with the tree, because Klosner knew that the tree screamed in pain, and therefore he also felt as if the wounds needed to be stitched up just like we do it in any human body. He was feeling pity for the tree. He was feeling empathy for the tree. So when the doctor ignorantly said, let's go back, leave this tree alone, we don't need to bother with this stuff anymore, let's go back, Klosner became angry, and he said, see, you're a doctor, and I want you to stitch these wounds up. You fix these wounds up. I want this tree to heal as soon as possible. Don't be silly, the doctor said. You do as I say. Stitch this up. Klosner was gripping the axe handle as he spoke softly in a curious, almost threatening tone. Of course, the doctor would be thinking, how can I stitch a tree bark? How can I stitch a trunk? I've never done that before. And this man, this crazy man, is asking me to stitch a tree. How is that possible? But Klosner wanted the doctor to heal the tree's wound anyway. So he started threatening the doctor. He said, fix this wound or face the circumstances, and saying that he also had an axe in his hand, as if he was gonna hurt the doctor if the doctor did not stitch the tree wounds. And finally the doctor replied, don't be silly, the doctor said. I can't stitch through wood. Come on, let's get back. So, you can't stitch through wood? No, of course not. For Klosner, things are really simple. Stitching a human being and stitching a wood. So he made a very, unusual request. He asked the doctor to stitch the tree bark. To that the doctor said, I can't do it. Are you silly? Let's go back. Then Klosner asked if the doctor had any iodine in his bag. Have you got any iodine in your bag? The doctor is annoyed and irritated and says, what if I have? Then paint the cut with iodine. Klosner had become emotional. It was as if he had built a strong bond with that tree. He wanted the tree's wounds to be healed anyway, and he was really angry at the doctor. He threatened the doctor by telling him that either he should stitch the wound or apply iodine. Now look, the doctor said. And again he turned as if to go. Let's not be ridiculous. Let's get back to the house and then paint the cut with iodine. Now this well-respected and well-reputed doctor, Dr. Scott, is unable to believe what he heard from Mr. Klosner. Klosner is asking a doctor to stitch a tree and to paint a tree bark with iodine. All of these things are very ridiculous for the doctor. And so he concluded, now see, don't act stupid, don't be ridiculous. Let's go back to the house. And then he was interrupted by Klosner with yet another threatening voice. Klosner said, paint the cut with iodine, do as I said. The doctor hesitated. He saw Klosner's hands tightening on the handle of the axe. He decided that his only alternative was to run away fast And he certainly wasn't going to do that. Now, a very strange situation was created for the doctor. First of all, he was very well aware that Klosner is a unique person, an unusual thinker. Secondly, he got carried away by listening to Klosner's words over the telephone and came back rushing right at 6 a.m. in the morning. Now, this man cut a tree with an axe and now he's asking the doctor to stitch up the wound or apply iodine, and that too with a threat. Klosner is clearly threatening the doctor. And how is that evident? That's evident because Klosner is holding the axe, the same axe by which he cut the tree. In his mind, the doctor thought, I should run away. This man is a mad person. This man is a maniac. Let me run away. But then he discarded the thought. He said, no, let me not do that. Instead, apply iodine. It won't be a big deal. So the doctor said, all right, I'll paint it with iodine. He got his black bag, which was lying on the grass about 10 yards away, opened it and took out a bottle of iodine and some cotton wool. Remember, the doctor had come with a black colored bag? Of course, the bag was meant to carry all the medicinal stuff because he used to visit his patients, and now that he already had come to Klosner's house, he thought of visiting the other patients after Klosner was done showing him whatever he wanted to. And therefore, fortunately, he had iodine in his black bag, which was a little bit away from the grass, a little bit away from the tree, 10 yards away. And finally, he got out some iodine and some cotton wool as if he was going to apply it on a human. He went up to the tree trunk, uncorked the bottle, dipped some of the iodine onto the coconut wool, bent down and began to dab it into the cut. Now, this doctor had to save his life twice. Once when the branch was falling right on top of his head, and now secondly when Klosner was standing there with an axe in his hand and threatening. So, he thought of complying with Klosner's demands, and he went up to the tree trunk and stood exactly where the bruise was made by Klosner and started dabbing the cotton wool which had some iodine applied on it, just like he would do it to a patient injured in a fatal accident. And he kept one eye on Klosner, who was standing motionless with the axe in his hands, watching him. Now, this patient had become a threat. Klosner had become a threat. So while he was applying iodine very gently, just the way Klosner wanted him to, he was paying attention to Klosner's action because Klosner was a strange person. Make sure you get it right in. A nominal thinker, normal person, not as educated as Dr. Scott, is threatening the doctor and explaining him how to apply iodine. He insisted the doctor to apply iodine correctly, all over the bruise. Yes, the doctor said in a very pitiable tone, now do the other one, the one just above it. Now friends, we know there were two bruises which were made by Klosner on the tree trunk. So Klosner wasn't satisfied with the doctor applying iodine on just one bruise. He wanted the tree to heal because for Klosner, the tree had become a being which experienced pain. So he again commanded the doctor to apply iodine on the second wound and not leave anything raw or hurt. The doctor did as he was told. There you are, he said, it's done. Now somewhere in his mind, the doctor knew that although Klosner was threatening, he was not a bad person. Something was really fishy in the way he behaved. And certainly the doctor knew that Klosner was never going to hit him with the axe. And so he must have thought of calming Klosner down so that he is satisfied. He straightened up and surveyed his work in a very serious manner. Now the doctor here is acting. He's trying to convince Klosner so that he becomes calm. And he says, that should do nicely. That should heal the wound of the tree nicely. Klosner came closer and gravely examined the two wounds. Now this sentence clearly shows how Klosner had developed a bond with the beech tree, who had just yelled when Klosner hurt it. And Klosner as if the tree was someone very, very close to him, comes to check if iodine was applied correctly, just like a supervisor, and very seriously examine the two wounds. And then he says, yes, nodding his huge head slowly up and down. Yes, that will do nicely. He stepped back a pace. You'll come again and look at them again tomorrow? We saw at the beginning of the chapter how the doctor visits Klosner to check if he was alright. So Klosner is imagining the same situation here. He is asking the doctor if he will come back to check if the wounds were healed tomorrow itself. How is that possible? Of course not. And after whatever happened, the doctor is never going to step inside Klosner's house, but still, to just bypass this situation, to escape quickly as possible, the doctor agrees to Klosner. Oh yes, the doctor said, of course, and put some more iodine on if necessary. Yes, the doctor is very well aware that iodine will not be helpful for the tree, but still the doctor says, yes, if necessary, I will come and I will check the wounds, and if they are healed, we will be okay, but if they are not, I will apply more iodine. Now, all of this is just to calm Klosner down. Thank you, doctor, Klosner said, and he nodded his head again, and he dropped the X, and all at once he smiled, a wild, excited smile, and quickly the doctor went over to him and gently he took him by the arm and he said, come on, we must go now. And suddenly they were walking away. The two of them were walking silently, rather hurriedly, across the park, over the road, back to the house. Klosner made the doctor do whatever he wanted to, and Klosner was happy that the doctor applied iodine. Not only that, the doctor will also come tomorrow to check if the wounds were healed. This is as if he was caring for a person who was just injured. And Klosner is a wild person when it comes to thinking. And all of a sudden, there is a change of emotion, change of expression. He is nodding his head and he threw away the X and was happy. And once he dropped his X, the doctor also felt relaxed, and he went over to him and very calmly looked at him and said, all right, Klosner, now shall we go back home? They were not talking. They were not discussing about Klosner's health or the machine or whatever that happened. They were calmly walking back to Klosner's house, which was across the park, over the road, very silently, very peacefully. And my dear friends, that brings us to the end of this story. Alright friends, now it's time for a quick summary. So there's a man named Klosner who invents a machine that can hear the sound the human ear cannot hear. It reproduces the sound on a lower pitch so that human beings can hear it. With this machine he hears roses scream as his neighbor cuts them. The next morning he hears a tree scream when he cuts into it with an X. He calls his doctor excitedly and asks him to come over at once. The doctor comes and Klosner says he wants him to listen to the tree's screams. He starts cutting into it with an X and a large branch begins to fall. They barely get out of the way in time. He asks the doctor if he heard the scream, but the doctor will not say that he did. Klosner is very upset and demands that the doctor paint the two gashes with iodine. Friends, I hope this story is very clear to you. If not, please ask me your doubts and questions in the comment section and I will be very happy to help. I hope you have a wonderful day ahead.